Hello everyone. Welcome to the paper presentation for DScribe at the 44th International Conference on Software Engineering. DScribe is a template-based approach to co-generate tests and documentation. My colleagues and I have implemented a tool to support DScribe for Java, which we described in a prior publication, the link to which is available on the current slide. In this presentation, we will present a tutorial of DScribe to help interested users onboard easily. But before we get started, let's take a quick look at the motivation behind DScribe. As we know, each software project has an abundant number of specifications. Normally, for each specification, we create a unit test and a documentation fragment. The specification is thus redundantly captured in both assets. After producing both assets independently, we must also ensure that they evolve consistently. This is all the more tedious when the specification reoccurs across many functions. Now, if the specification evolves, we must manually update each asset. Without traceability links and tool support, this is an effort-intensive and error-prone process. If you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, is there a better way? DScribe allows developers to define each specification once using simple templates, which we will explore in detail shortly. After creating a template, developers can use a single Java annotation to generate unit tests and documentation in a consistent and streamlined fashion. To show DScribe in action, we use Apache log4j2 as our use case. Log4j2 has a pattern converter interface that defines a format method. The format method transforms and appends information from an inputted object to an inputted string builder. Log4j2 has over 100 unit tests with format as the focal method, each of which follows a very similar pattern. For example, here are two such tests. Both tests start by instantiating a log event, a string builder, and a pattern converter instance. They then call the focal method, passing the log event and string builder instance as input. Finally, they both use JUnit's assert equals method to validate the results. Despite their similarities, these tests have various code elements that differ. For example, both tests set a different log event field. They also instantiate different concrete pattern converters. And of course, they have different expected values. With DScribe, we can create templates that decouple the general concern being tested from the test case specific information. To do so, we abstract all test case specific information using placeholders. In DScribe, placeholders are denoted using surrounding $signs. We can also reference these placeholders to generate descriptive test method names. This code skeleton is one of two components that comprise a DScribe template. The second component is a documentation fragment that describes the behavior under test, i.e., the specification. In this example, the documentation fragment illustrates a usage example of format by referencing the placeholders. To finalize the template, we assign format as the template's name. The template creation step is the perfect time to consider which test and documentation conventions your team wants to enforce. For example, here we've enhanced the format template by adding some common test conventions, such as delimiting your test methods into arrange, act, and assert sections. Now that we've defined a template, we can start using it to generate assets. But before we can do so, we must first configure the log4j2 project to use DScribe. Here we have the log4j2 project cloned in our Eclipse IDE. The first thing that we need to do is create a folder named DScribe. Inside the folder, we need to create a file named config.properties. This is where you will define all of your project's DScribe configuration properties. The list of all possible properties is available on DScribe's README. Each property has a default value, so you only need to provide values for the properties for which you want to overwrite the default value. For example, the test class name convention property defines the convention used to identify the test class associated with a given production class. By default, given a production class, DScribe assumes that its test class has the same name just with test prefixed to it. However, in log4j2, the string test is postfixed to the test classes rather than prefixed. As such, we must overwrite the default value. Next, we need to create a folder called Templates. This is where you will store all of your project's DScribe templates. For example, this is where we will store the format template that we defined earlier. You are free to organize your template definitions across different Java classes as long as they are all within the templates folder. In DScribe, we invoke templates by adding a Java annotation with the same name as the target template to the focal method. Hence, we need to define one Java annotation per template. You are free to organize these annotations as you like. You may decide to define them in a separate package that you share across different software projects. In this example, we will create a new DScribe package within the log4j2 project that has a single class named DScribe annotations. Depending on the number of templates you have, you may want to partition the annotation definitions across multiple classes. In order to create an annotation for the format template, we must create an annotation called format. The annotation must include one parameter for each placeholder that is defined in the template. Each DScribe annotation must also include an additional parameter called UUT, short for unit under test. You do not need to worry about this parameter. DScribe uses it behind the scenes to trace the generated test back to its focal method. Since we want to use this annotation multiple times, we must mark it with the repeatable meta annotation as well as declare a containing annotation type. And that completes the configuration process. We can now start using the format template to generate assets. For example, if we want to test and document an implementation of the format method that appends the log events thread ID to the string builder, we simply add the format annotation to the focal method and provide values for each placeholder. The field that we want to set is thread ID. If we set the thread ID to 1, then the expected value is also 1. And the params value is used to instantiate the pattern converter. In this case, we just set it to null. We do not have to provide a value for the class placeholder because DScribe automatically derives it. Once we invoke a template or multiple templates, we are ready to run DScribe. There are different ways to run DScribe: as a jar file, as an Eclipse project, or using the DScribe Eclipse plugin. The most user-friendly way is using the plugin. For instructions on how to install the DScribe Eclipse plugin, you can visit the plugin's README. After invoking templates, developers can use the plugin to generate assets for any production class. To do so, simply right-click on the class in Eclipse's Project Explorer view and then select the Run DScribe command. When generation is complete, a dialog appears listing all of the classes for which assets have been added or modified, as well as any errors that occurred. We can see that DScribe has added the usage example to the format method. It has also added a new unit test to the corresponding test class and automatically moved the annotation from the focal method to the generated test. This keeps code clutter-free and helps developers discern which annotation is responsible for which test. To maintain a trace to the focal method, DScribe adds an additional member to the annotation called UUT. If we want to update the usage example, say by changing the thread ID's value to 15, we simply modify the annotation's values and rerun DScribe. As you can see, DScribe successfully changed the placeholder values in both the test and the documentation fragment. The format specification in log4j2 is an excellent example of how developers can leverage DScribe to reduce the effort required to generate assets for recurrent, project-specific specifications. On top of project-specific specifications, developers can also leverage DScribe to test and document universal specifications. That is, specifications that appear in most software projects regardless of their domain or features. Examples include specifications about exceptions, equals contracts, and clone contracts. To help developers get started using DScribe, we provide a set of 6 predefined templates that capture well-known universal specifications. The templates are available on DScribe's README and are also accompanied by their corresponding annotation definitions. Let's try to use the assert throws predefined template. To do so, all we need to do is copy the template definition into the template class. We also need to copy the assert throws annotation definition as well as its containing annotation type into our DScribe annotations class. And then we can start using the assert throws template. For example, the lookup method in the Java lookup class throws an illegal argument exception if the inputted key does not exist. To test and document this specification, we simply add the assert throws annotation to the focal method and once again provide a value for each placeholder. The state under test is non-existent key. The exception type is java.lang.illegalargumentException. For the parameters, we will pass a null value for the log event since it is not important for our test case. And we will pass boo as our non-existent key. For the factory, we will reference an existing Java lookup instance that we have set up in our test class. As with the class parameter, we do not need to provide a value for the method parameter because DScribe automatically derives it. After running DScribe, we can see that the specification has been added to the lookup methods Java doc, and the appropriate unit test has been added to the corresponding test class. You can follow the same steps to use any of the other predefined templates. If you missed any steps or just want a refresher, DScribe's README lists all of the steps in detail. And that concludes the tutorial of DScribe. To summarize, DScribe is a template-based approach to co-generate unit tests and documentation. DScribe offers developers many benefits. First, it reduces the amount of developer effort required to produce tests and documentation. Second, DScribe's template-based approach enforces a uniform style throughout the tests and the documentation, which, in turn, reduces the cognitive load required to understand them. Lastly, by generating documentation from the same source as the tests, DScribe also solves the documentation traceability problem, and thereby ensures that the documentation is accurate, since outdated documentation is immediately flagged by failing tests. All in all, DScribe does not aim to replace manual testing, but to streamline testing and documenting boilerplate specifications. This allows developers to focus on more complex, component-specific specifications. Once more, here are all of the relevant links. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy using DScribe.